Okay, well, hello everybody and welcome. You're in the right place if you're here to see the FusionReactor webinar, Getting the Most Out of FusionReactor Ultimate. And I'm Charlie Hart, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. And let me go ahead and start with a couple of points of introduction. So I'm an independent consultant, just to clarify. I work for myself. My site is careheart.org. I'm not an employee of Integral, the company that makes FusionReactor, but I'm a longtime fan of the product, used it for over 10 years, and they've been wonderful about it in how they update it and how they respond to feedback, and I've just always enjoyed working with them. So over the years, I've grown to also become an evangelist for them and speak at conferences and do these webinars for them. Very happy to do it. But I do just focus on server troubleshooting, and I show people how to use FusionReactor with whatever application server they have, and we'll talk about that in a moment because some of you may be surprised to hear who can use FusionReactor. It's more than just the server you're using. So we'll do a quick overview of this talk and a couple of other points in preparation for the talk. And then, while the talk's focus is about this Ultimate Edition, some of you may not understand the distinction between Ultimate and the other editions, so we'll talk about these differences just briefly. And especially, I want to just highlight in one screen what the features are of Enterprise, because if you move up to Ultimate, you'd get them as well. But the bulk of the presentation is to focus on the features that are unique to Ultimate, and those are the Production Profiler and Production Debugger. So most of the talk will be about those. And then we'll wrap up with news on other upcoming webinars and other resources you can use, and we'll take time for questions and answers in the end. Okay. So just quickly, this is a talk that's meant for people that are presumed to already be using FusionReactor. So there's a lot of fundamentals about it that I'm not going to go over. We've had several other webinars, and there's ample resources online. And again, I'll point to those throughout and at the end. But we're presuming you already understand the fundamentals of FusionReactor. The thing is, you may or may not yet be using FusionReactor 6, or you might be on FusionReactor 6, but not yet using FusionReactor 6 Ultimate. Or you might even be on FusionReactor 6 Ultimate and just not yet using these specific features. And I've seen that where some people had Ultimate but still hadn't used these primary features, maybe because they thought they'd get around to it and didn't, or maybe somebody bought it and they didn't know that it included these features. So that's what we're going to talk about. Now, here's a point I always like to make. I want to make sure everyone understands this. FusionReactor can be used with any Java or CFML server, pretty much any one. So all these features apply to any that FusionReactor can monitor. So if you're running FusionReactor on Tomcat or WildFly or Jetty and you're doing Java apps, everything I'm going to say applies just as well. I suspect that a lot of the people that come to these webinars are coming from the CFML environments of ColdFusion, Lucy, Rilo, Blue Dragon, and of course supports all of those. And once in a while I might favor talking about that just because that's the majority of the audience that I tend to end up speaking to. But again, this stuff applies absolutely the same whether you're on CFML or Java. And finally, the presentation is being recorded, so you'll be able to revisit the details that we bring up, whether it's some particular mouse click we do or some particular URL that we mention. And you'll all get an email after the presentation in the next couple of days giving you the recording URL. Okay, so I'd mentioned that there's these three editions, Standard, Enterprise, and Ultimate. And let me say, too, before we go any further, that they have nothing to do, for those ColdFusion people here, they have nothing to do with the equivalent names of Standard and Enterprise in ColdFusion. Nothing at all. So again, like I said, what I'm talking about is not unique to ColdFusion. So just don't get that association in your head. So until FusionReactor 6, there were just two editions, Standard and Enterprise. I'm talking about a FusionReactor, Standard and Enterprise. And prior to FusionReactor 6, the main difference in Enterprise was this feature called the Enterprise Dashboard. And the Enterprise Dashboard was something that allowed you to watch multiple instances of FusionReactor from a single screen. And again, if anybody gets intrigued about that, let me clarify here. All the instances have to be at least FusionReactor Enterprise or Ultimate. You can't watch a FusionReactor Standard from the dashboard. But anyway, so that was the primary point of the Enterprise edition of FusionReactor, was to be able to have this Enterprise dashboard and watch multiple instances from a single screen. And that was really valuable And we're going to have another webinar in the future talking about that. But it let you see not only at a high level what was going on across all your instances, and you could group them and that sort of stuff, but you could also drill into one, and it was a subset of the functionality of the FusionReactor interface itself. And then you could drill even further and go right into a given FusionReactor instance. So the dashboard is very powerful when you have more than one instance and you want to watch them from one screen. Now, FusionReactor 5 had added mobile applications, and the mobile applications integrate with the enterprise dashboard. So if you get enterprise, you get the dashboard and you get these mobile apps, and the mobile apps look at the dashboard, and that's interesting. And then FusionReactor 6 has added still more features to enterprise. I'm going to show you in a moment what those features now are of enterprise. So I'm trying to say that if you're going to move from standard to ultimate, you're going to get enterprise in the bargain, and it used to just be that what you got was the dashboard and or the mobile apps, but now you're getting still more. So I want you to appreciate that there's more to enterprise than maybe you realized. And then FusionReactor 6 added this new Ultimate Edition, and the Ultimate Edition is everything in enterprise plus the production profiler and the production debugger. And those, again, are what we're going to talk about today. I also want to point out that when you get the 14-day free trial of FusionReactor, what you get is Ultimate. So if you want to experiment and experience it, just go get the trial, put it on a machine where you don't currently have FusionReactor, and what you'll get will be the Ultimate Edition. And let me just throw out there that if you are somebody who is currently running FusionReactor 6 Standard or Enterprise because that's the license that you had and maybe you upgraded from 5 to 6, you can actually implement the FusionReactor Ultimate Trial license key in your environment. You would just take out your current key, put in the trial key, and for 14 days you'll have Ultimate. Just remember at the end of the 14 days you've got to put your real production key back in to revert yourself back to your FusionReactor 6 Standard or Enterprise. And then if you decide you want to upgrade, you can buy an upgrade. So anyway, that's just to let you guys know that you can try this stuff out. And so the point is, what we're going to show you today applies whether you have bought Ultimate and are running it, or if you're just trialing it. You've got the full FusionReactor Ultimate available to you in the trial. So let's quickly look at what is in that enterprise version now as of FusionReactor 6, and therefore also available to you in Ultimate. So if you consider upgrading, what do you really get besides those two primary features? Well, I mentioned you get the dashboard, and that's nice. It also offers notification about unresponsive servers. So beyond just watching things, it has additional email notification features so that if a watched instance is unresponsive to the dashboard talking to it, then you get an email saying, hey, the dashboard can't reach an instance. So that could be interesting. And you can script a response to that. So you could detect that an instance was unresponsive and choose to restart that instance. And there's ways to do that whether the instance is on the same box as the dashboard or even if the instance is on a different box from the dashboard. And that's all covered in various docs in the FusionReactor documentation. And again, at the end, I'll point you to that documentation, but you should just know that if you aren't using that feature, if you're on Enterprise or Ultimate and maybe you're using the dashboard but never looked into scripting responses to unresponsiveness, check that out. That's a powerful feature. And again, we plan to do another webinar on the dashboard. And again, the mobile apps provide access to the dashboard and details about the instances. And those mobile apps are available for iOS and Android and phones and tablets and everything. Now, I said that FusionReactor 6 added more to Enterprise. First, FusionReactor 5 and above Standard has had daily reports, but FusionReactor 6 Enterprise adds some enhanced daily reports, and it adds weekly and monthly reports. And we talked a bit about these in some other webinars. Again, this talk is about what's in Ultimate, so I'm not going to go into detail about these things. I admit these are just bullet points, but I just want you to be aware that these are things that you'll get in the bargain when you go to Ultimate from Standard. These are in Enterprise, and they come to you in Ultimate as well. There's also a new System Resources view, so over on the left you'll see a Resources tab, and when you click it, there's various things in there, and they watch your entire server, not just your instance of ColdFusion or Blueground or Lucy or Rilo or Tomcat or JBoss or WildFly. These watch the whole server. So they watch the CPU, the memory, sorry, sorry for the duplication there, network, disk, and process execution. So lots of great information, various system metrics at a high level about your whole server, which can be very useful because sometimes problems you have in the instance that you're interested in turn out not to be because of the instance, but they turn out to be because of things happening on the box. And the instance is suffering and is the victim of something else. So this is valuable to be able to see what's going on in the whole system. And then finally, there's a new applications view. Applications which show aggregation of various parts of FusionReactor's current information, but breaking it down by application. And that per application view capability is, excuse me, in Enterprise. So you get that in Enterprise and Ultimate. Okay, so that's that. I want to stop for a second and see if anybody has any questions on anything I've said so far before we dive into those features that are unique to Ultimate. Anybody, any questions or comments? Okay, and it doesn't show me if you're typing, so I'll only see it once you've typed your question. So I'll try to keep an eye on that as we go. Just check real quick to see if there's any feedback in any social media. Nope. Okay. Or not all social media, but something in particular, so don't worry about that. I meant if a background conversation was happening between me and somebody else. Okay, so let's move on to these features unique to Ultimate. And the first one that I want to talk about is the production profiler. The production profiler. What this is about is helping you to understand where time was spent within a request, in particular where the most time was spent within a request. If you stop to think about that, that's pretty powerful, because if you've been working with troubleshooting applications, again, whether they're CFML or Java, it's not at all difficult with FusionReactor to see what requests are slow, and you might say, I don't even need that. You know what requests are slow. Users complain about it. But as you try to go digging into why they're slow, that's quite challenging. It could be anything, right? You might have a 10-line or 100-line, 1,000-line template or program, and trying to know where it's slow. You know, for years, all you could do is eyeball the code, and people passed around various, guesses of this might be slow, this might be better, try this versus that. And honestly, I've always argued that all those approaches, while I understand that that's all people had, they've not been productive. What you want is something diagnostically to tell you where your problems are. So FusionReactor was great to make it clear that you had slow requests. Sometimes that's a surprise, and how many slow requests, and who they're coming from, or what the URL is, or the query string, or the user agent, or the IP address. So those are all things that FusionReactor can tell you. But even with that information, and let me just say, FusionReactor could also tell you how much time was spent in a query. Let me just quickly show an example. I'm going to go on to my server, careheart.org, and let's just have me take a look at one of my slow requests. We've gone over this in other webinars, that besides what's running now, the activity, and what's run recently, the 100 most recent requests, you can also see what requests have been the slowest of all since you've had your instance running. And then I like slow requests, which is the most recent requests that were slow. So it's not in descending order of duration, it's in descending order of recency, when they last finished. And so just a minute ago, this request was slow. Don't know why. And I would wonder why. And now, before I get into using the new features in Enterprise, I just want to show you what might you typically do with FusionReactor as you have it today in Standard, Enterprise, or Ultimate. And so you may know that you can see that list of slow requests. You can click on the link here or click on the button here and drill into that request. And I'm just picking a random request. It just happened. I don't know why it was slow, but I want to show you what I would do to try to find out why it was slow. I would notice, okay, it ran for 8.5 seconds. And right here on this detail page in the main tab, I would scroll down, and the first thing I'd look at is, okay, well, how much time was spent in total query time? So in this request, there were 13 queries, and some of you may know that you can come up here and look at the queries in this JDBC tab, and you'll see the queries in descending order of duration. You'll see the full SQL statement, okay, and how long it took. But again, I don't even go there first, and I would recommend you don't go there first. What you should look at first is right on this very first page, go down in the bottom of the details and say, okay, how much time was spent on queries? Because look, there was only, and again, I didn't plan this, there was only 236 milliseconds of the 8,000 milliseconds that this request ran. So no, my problem in this request was not queries. Now sometimes it will be, and that's what I'm trying to say, is that if you just quickly look at this, then yeah, your problem is queries, and go look at the JDBC tab and see what the queries were and deal with that. But if you were to go to the JDBC tab first and foremost, you'd go, there's nothing there slower than a couple milliseconds. What's up? So I don't go there first. I look here first, and then I decide what to do about it. Now, when I see that it's not queries, or most of it's not queries, there's still one more thing you should all know you can do. Go to this Relations tab. Right here to the left of all these is, to the right of all these is Relations. Now, Relations breaks down the request into different parts that FusionReactor does monitor. So this is the whole request, and within the request, this is how much time was spent doing queries, and not much of the request. We've seen that already. Not much was doing queries. And there are other things that FusionReactor tracks, like a CF application tag if you do it, or some other things. So, but it's not finding anything. So none of the traditional things that it does track is showing an explanation for why it was slow. Now, I'll just throw out there that sometimes you will see that. For those on CFML, another thing that's commonly tracked is CF HTTP, or for you Java folks, HTTP client library calls. That's the application you've written calling out to some other website, web page, application, whatever. If it calls out, that's tracked within the request, and you'd see CF HTTP or HTTP client, or maybe both, listed in here. And I'm just saying, sometimes you go, oh, okay, that's where the time was spent. It wasn't in queries, it was in an HTTP call to another thing. And there's your explanation, and maybe it took up most of the time. And you could drill in and find out what the URL is. FusionReactor can show you all that. But here's the thing. Here's an example where no, it's none of that. It's none of that. And so I'm stuck. Where was the time spent? So again, this was just coincidental. I picked one. This is going to work well. So with that request, when I don't know why, where did the 8 seconds go, this is where the profiler comes in. Now, you may have noticed that there's a link, because I have the Ultimate Edition. There's a link here to Profiler. There's a link here to Profiler. And if I go back to the previous page that was showing the slow requests, and if you were to see it on the request history or the active request, if any request takes longer than 2 seconds by default, FusionReactor will show this profiler option. And we'll talk about that in a bit, but by default, it will profile on its own without you doing anything, any request that's slower than 2 seconds. And so I could get to the profiler here or in those tabs within the details. So what is the profiler, right? That's really the meat of this discussion now. So I'm going to click on the profiler. And it's going to look a bit like gibberish to some folks, because you don't spend a lot of time looking at stack traces. But as I scroll down this page, you're going to see what looks like a Java stack trace. Now, some of you may jump ahead and start looking at it, but let's just talk big picture. Stack traces are under the covers, in the case of CFML, what are the Java methods that got called? And for those who didn't know, if you're a Java person listening along and you've heard of ColdFusion, if you didn't know it, yeah, ColdFusion is Java. And when you write in your CFML code, under the covers, it gets turned into Java code. And that Java code then executes, just like any Java class and any Java server. And ColdFusion runs on Java servers. Lucy and Rilo and Blue Dragon all run on Java servers. So your CFML turns into Java. That's the point. And that Java then executes, and just like any profiler for you Java people, the profiler is watching and saying, okay, well, where's the most time spent in the methods that got executed? Now, we're not seeing every method that got executed. We're seeing what were the methods that had the most time spent in them, and this aggregates that information and breaks it down. And we can see that 96% of this request was in whatever this is. Now, some of you can look at that and go, oh, okay, it's something to do with SQL, and it's something to do with getting a connection. Well, there you go. So there was a problem trying to get a connection, and you can see it was waiting on a lock. Now, we could dig in further if you wanted to, but I just want you to see that this is right there is informative. I can see that 96% of the time was spent having something to do with getting a connection. So it wasn't running the query, but it was trying to get a connection to be able to run a query. And that could point to any number of issues. It could be issues in the network between the CFML or Java server and your database server. Or it could be issues on the database server. I've seen situations like this where something running on the database server, like an antivirus tool, or a backup in some DBMSs, or some heavy operation that's whatever in the DBMS or on the database server, could be making the database server not respond quickly to this engine's attempt to get a connection. So again, I don't want to drill into the details of a particular problem. I just want you to get that this shows me that 96% of this request was waiting to get a connection. All right? And we already can see it's a query, so I don't need to drill any further. And I would just want to see if that's a common problem, and if so, maybe attend to it. And before I go any further, let me just look real quick and see if there's any new questions having popped up. I'm running the Ultimate Edition. I don't see the profile options. Is this something that has to be turned on? No, Mark, it's not something that has to be turned on, as far as I know. Now, there is a way to turn it off, and you could have somebody who turned it off, and we'll talk a little bit about how to configure it. But Mark, before we go any further, did you catch that I said you'll only see it if a request is slower than 2 seconds by default? So again, don't go looking at your request activity page. Don't go looking at your request history page. Go look at your requests slow request or requests longest requests and see if among the requests that show running longer than 2 seconds, do you see the profiler option listed? And I'll wait for you to answer that. And while we wait, I'm going to go ahead and move on, because I want to show you a different example, because again, we can tell already, okay, that's a query, so we've got to deal with whatever that query problem is. I'm going to go ahead and create in the background a synthetic request. So you're not going to see me run this, but just take my word for it. I'm running another request in the background. Okay, so I'm running it now. And it's going to be taking a while to run. And I'm going to go to the FusionReactor display. And I want to show you, for those who don't know, and I'll come back to you in a moment, Mark, because I want to work on this one that's running right now. If we look at my FusionReactor display, and if I go to requests, sorry, I'm having some multi-monitor problems at the moment. We'll tell you what, since I'm having trouble with that, let me just go, I'll let it run and we'll come back to it when it's done. Mark says, I did only look at the slow requests. I have plenty that are long. I also don't see the profile option in the left-hand menu under the debug option either. It's not under the debug, well, it's underneath the debug option. So there's debug is one button and profiler is another. So Mark, I don't know what to tell you. If you're telling me that when you click on the debug option, you don't get an error saying, hey, you're not running Ultimate, which means therefore you must be running Ultimate. I don't know why you wouldn't even see the profiler button. I've never heard of that happening before. I'm not aware of there being any OSs where the profiler option doesn't appear. And I'll just say, at the end, you'll see I'm going to give you links to emails. There's an email called support@fusion-reactor.com, and I would recommend you send an email to support and ask them about that. Take a screenshot. Let me tell you also to click the FusionReactor About in the top left corner. Click FusionReactor, then click About, and see the version and the information and that sort of stuff, and send that screenshot, and they should be able to get you going. And somebody else said, is there a good resource to look up these Java methods for help in troubleshooting? Like I have one saying JavaNet socket input stream native method that sits 15 seconds sometimes. I'm not 100% sure what that is. DB timeout. Well, right now I don't have time to get into that, but I'll just answer the question to say, no, there is not any good resource. But I'm going to show you, listen, Rob, I'm going to show you in a moment me drilling into a request that I have, and maybe you're not using a thing that you should use that will tell you what it is. I'm going to connect this to a line of code, and if you're running CFML, you're going to see how you can directly connect this to a given line of CFML. Okay, so let me get back to the display we were working on before. So if I go to my requests, slow requests now, and I was going to try to catch it while I was running to make a point, but in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and move on. So in my requests, slow requests, here you can see I ran a request that took 40 seconds. And I want to know why it took 40 seconds. And like I showed you before, the first thing you do is come into the details and look at it and say, okay, 40 seconds, what were you doing? Gosh, what queries were you running? Oh, you weren't running anything. 0 queries, 0 query time. Wow, what were you doing? Okay, second thing is, okay, well, let's look at relations. What were you doing? Huh, you weren't doing anything that FusionReactor is specifically tracking. So now that's when we have no choice but to use the profiler. And remember, you can get to it any of several ways. I'll just go ahead and click it here. It's the same stuff, doesn't matter. So here's the profiler. Now, Rob, you were saying that you saw at the top, I suppose, or maybe one of these, you saw it running a particular method, and you didn't know what that method was. And I'm going to show you guys now that as we look at this one, we may see stuff that go process content. I don't know what that is. Export content, set storm page format. What? You know, you may not recognize this stuff. But check this out. This is just what FusionReactor has tried to distill down and say, this is where the most time was spent. But if you notice up here, it says collapsed methods, show. This is far more important than you might think. Now, when you first look at it, it's 67 new lines, and it's going to make the stuff scroll off the screen because it's so many different methods, and they all just look like, okay, org, Apache, blah, 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 whatever. But keep going down, keep going down. Now, I've noticed in most browsers that it doesn't show a scroll bar down here, and even my right and left key on the keyboard don't go to the right or left. And so eventually you get down here, it's like, hey, where'd the stuff go? But I find that if you just click and drag to the left, it'll move. So there you go as I keep going down here. Eventually we get to, there was that set storm page format, which again, I don't know what that is, off the top of my head. I know what it is, but you would look at that and go, I don't know what that is. And this process content, I don't know what that is. But look, here's the thing. Remember I said this is showing the Java methods that your CFML code turned into. And as you scroll up this list, you usually, not always, but usually you're going to see eventually something that looks like a line, a file name of your application. So here we see, in my case, I'm running in a simple Windows IIS environment, inet pub www, called it load test, create pdf.cfm. That was the template I was running, and you might go, okay, well, I already knew from the URL. No, that's not the point. So now we know it was running this template, and then what we do is look at the very next line down. Now, if you're used to looking at stack traces, you'd look up. Leave that for another time. But in this, you look down and say, okay, well, that line, whatever that was, turned into this Java method. Now, this Java method, if you look to the left, it says it's associated with this ColdFusion tag, document tag. And some of you might go, oh, that's a CF document. So again, I know this is a bit CFML-ish. If you're a Java person, you just take it and run with it because you know your Java methods. But for CFML folks, you need to understand what did the CFML turn into, and usually the next line is going to give you a hint that that turned into this, and that was a some tag, CF some tag, CF document tag. So this is basically we can see it's a closing CF document tag, and it's doing the processing of what was in the body of the CF document tag. So boom, now I know that 100% of the time of this request was spent doing a CF document tag. Now, yours may not be 100% because mine was just a simple little test and it just does that. Yours might have, 1,000 lines in it, and maybe 80 lines of it ran, and one of them was a CF document, and it might say it's 80%. But the point is, it's going to show you where the most time was spent, and you may see that, yeah, the most time was spent doing a CF document tag. Now, it goes on further to break it down, and I can see that 80% of that 100% was doing whatever a document frame export content is, and then 18% of it was doing get response. Again, I don't go any further. This is not important right now to look at every example, but I wanted you to get that you can see by going into the show of the details that were hidden, you can usually connect the dots and go, aha, it was this line of code. Okay, and for those who've seen other webinars or read things I've written or seen other resources about FusionReactor, with a stack trace, you could literally see exactly what line it is. This doesn't show that stack trace for various reasons and then that line number, but you can usually connect the dots, okay? So let me go see now if there was a follow-up from Rob or anybody else. Okay, good. He agreed that it was very nice and that should be able to help him. Good deal. All right. So that's the profiler, and I hope you guys can appreciate how powerful that is. I mean, again, remember what I said from the beginning. It helps you to see where most of the time was spent in the processing of your request. And with that, you're generally able to get to the bottom of what the problem was in that particular request that was slow. Great stuff. And listen, I want you to understand this. It is very low overhead. I'm sure the Java folks among you, whether you're pure Java folks or CFML folks who've learned about Java, everything you've ever heard about profiling was, ooh, you don't want to turn on profiling in production. Forget about it. This is not that. This is not your father's profiling. This is very low overhead. FusionReactor does it very intelligently. So it's really powerful. And I just showed you the demonstration. Now let's talk about what we were talking about earlier with Mark. It is enabled automatically, and it automatically starts tracking requests that are slower than 2 seconds. And let that be a testament to you of how confident the FusionReactor team is that this is low overhead, because they wouldn't turn it on automatically and have it running for any request slower than 2 seconds if it was going to cause negative overhead. For those maybe new to FusionReactor, the team behind it, like I said, the product's been out for over 10 years. The team behind it has always been committed to ensuring that FusionReactor never contribute any overhead that you would notice. So it's obviously not no overhead, but it's so negligible. And they've got various metrics, like over millions of requests, it was less than 1% of overhead. I've never even seen it do that, and I've seen things where it was on and not on, and I never saw any difference. But anyway, the point is, if you ever saw an impact of FusionReactor, you let the support team know, and within a couple days, usually they're going to come out with a fix because something's wrong. And there's something unique about your environment or what you're doing, or maybe a new version or something, but they'll deal with it and fix it. So anyway, they are so confident in this that it is on by default, and it does track anything slower than 2 seconds. But that's configurable. You can control if it's on, whether it engages at a certain time, and how often it's doing samples. Because here's what's really going on. When it kicks on at 2 seconds, it starts doing profiling in the classic sense of saying, hey, what's this thread doing right now? And I believe it's every 200 milliseconds. It says, okay, 200 milliseconds later, what are you doing? 200 milliseconds later, what are you doing? So 5 times a second, it's saying, what are we doing? What are we doing? What are we doing? What are we doing? And that's still deemed by them through testing and experience with hundreds of thousands of people using FusionReactor 6 Ultimate that it's not a high overhead. But if you had a problem, you can configure it. Let's go see how to do that. In FusionReactor, I'm going to go way back to the top left corner. And here's the buttons that Mark was referring to. He said that he could see a debug icon. We'll come back to that in a bit. But he couldn't see a profiler. I mean, I'm really surprised. I've never heard of the profiler button not appearing in Ultimate. Now, I believe it even appears in Standard and Enterprise, but if you click it, it says you don't have Ultimate, so you can't use it. So that's just so they let you know that those are there, and if you want to use them, you got to upgrade. And that's smart. But anyway, so here's active profiling. So I believe that is, okay, that's what is currently being profiled. And then profiling settings is whether it's enabled or not. And so there it is, profile slow transactions. So Mark, take a look and see if that was enabled or not. But again, I don't think that would influence the appearance of this icon. It just influences whether the thing does its thing or not. And I don't know if this is the default. Maybe it's 3 seconds. I might have been misspeaking when I said 2 seconds. So that's 3 seconds minimum transaction time and 200 millisecond sample rate. And by the way, many people use FusionReactor for years and never noticed this. All these little eye buttons, they're there for a reason. You can click on them and find out what that thing's talking about. Okay. And then there's the maximum profile duration for a transaction and for a thread. And again, you can read those and understand what they're about. So I'm going to leave you guys to look into that more. And if you make any changes, then you go down here to the bottom right corner and save your settings. Okay. All right. So let's move on to the production debugger. And before I do, let me just take a quick look and see if there's any questions. New questions? No. And I'm going to go ahead and delete these ones that have appeared so far. Okay. All right, so let's move on to the production debugger. So remember, there's two primary features of the Ultimate Edition, the profiler, and now we'll spend the next like 15 minutes on the debugger, and then we'll wrap up. So the debugger, notice it's called the production debugger. Again, this is intended for use in production. And that's a shock to some people because, again, their especially Java experience, perhaps even also CFML and other language experiences, well, I don't want to debug production. And what do we mean by debugging? Well, traditionally, and in FusionReactor's debugger, this refers to step debugging, meaning intercepting a request in the midst of it running at some point or on some condition or because of some error, whatever, intercepting it and stopping the request and looking at the request at a line of code and saying, what are the values of variables at this line of code? And let me step to the next line of code. Where does it go to? Does it execute this if? Is it true or false? Does it go to this line of code? Is it executed or not? Go to the next one below it. Literally stepping through your code line by line. Now, some people have never done that because A, they never knew it was possible, or B, they assumed they should not do it, or C, they tried to do it, and especially in the CFML world, they tried to do it with traditional tools that were made available, and they may have had difficulty because usually to get debugging to work, you had to set up an editor or an IDE more particularly, and you had to get that IDE properly configured, and then you had to set up your server, and you had to get the server properly configured. And it's possible, and I've been doing it for over 10 years with people, and believe it or not, even all the way back to CF4, there was a debugger. In CF5, there was a step debugger in ColdFusion Studio. But anyway, in the years since, there have been debuggers in CF Builder and in Eclipse and CF Eclipse. You could add one from Adobe. And then Integral, the company that makes FusionReactor, also made a debugger called Fusion Debug. And Fusion Debug was a plugin for Eclipse. And it worked really well. And for many people, it worked better than the other ones. But still, you'd have to set up an editor with that approach. This is not that approach. FusionReactor's debugger is all done entirely within your browser. No editor required. No server configuration required. All you need is FusionReactor 6 Ultimate, and you get the debugger built in. Now, let me say before I go to demonstrating it now, some of you might be checking out at this point thinking, I'm never going to do step debugging because A, I think that's still risky and I would never want to put my server at risk. Well, we're going to talk about how it can be made to be very safe. There's lots of features in the FusionReactor debugger to make it safe to use in production. Again, they wouldn't release it if it could cause harm. So just take my word for it, stick around, because you may be surprised to find out that it can be made safer than you ever imagined. But then another thing is you might say, well, I still don't want to go stepping through my code. In fact, if I have a problem for a user, I don't want to interrupt their request. So no, thank you, but no. No, hold on. There's another feature which I'll show you where instead of you interrupting the request and stepping through the code, the debugger can intercept the fact that whatever happened, the line was hit, the condition was hit, the error happened, and listen, you can have the debugger send you an email, and in that email will be tremendous information about the state of the application at that point. Okay, so don't think this as just a step debugger. It doesn't need to intercept and stop and step through the code. There's great value to that, but it can also just email you state information about the request in a way that no other debugger ever has. You know, for those on CFML, the ColdFusion and Lucy debuggers, they can't tell you at a particular line of code what the values of variables are, but this can. And you can do it at different points and get an email that tells you at different points, here's what the value was here, here's what the value was there. So now those who know about traditional debugging, and maybe you typically were doing dumps and CF outputs, things like that, this is way better than that. And you don't have to touch your code. None of this involves touching your code. So anyway, let's back up and just show simple traditional step debugging, and then we'll talk about the evolution beyond that that's possible. So in FusionReactor, again, there is a debug icon here on the left. And that debug icon, you can go to settings and enable it or not, but it is enabled by default. I'm waiting for it to come up on my screen. Sometimes, there you go. So it is enabled by default under General, FusionReactor Debugging General, enabled. And if you're going to send the emails, you'll configure the email there. And there's not much else you need to change. The bigger point is that you come in here and you create a breakpoint. Okay, so those familiar with debuggers know that you create a breakpoint, and when you create a breakpoint, usually you're pointing at some line of code and you're telling it what the line of code is. Now again, in an editor, you'd have a visual interface where you'd be looking at the code and you'd right-click on the line and say set a breakpoint here. Well, this isn't an editor, so we don't have that, but you can just point to your code, and I'll show an example in a moment, but you point to the real physical path on the server of the drive and or the folder and then the template or program name. You point to that, and then you point to a line number. If you want to use line numbers, you point to a line number. If you want to put a condition in, you can do that as well. So it's got to be if it hits that line number and this condition is true. And by the way, that condition can be any valid condition for the language you're coding. So if we're doing CFML, we can do whatever you would do in a CFF, for instance. It's any condition in the language of CFML. If you're Java, you would do Java language syntax. Anyway, now here's where things start to get into the potential safety features of FusionReactor's debugger. By default, such a breakpoint would always fire, but you can configure it to say, no, only fire one time. So listen to what I'm saying. If we set it up to cause a problem, sorry, to catch a problem, to interrupt a request, the default would be to catch it every time it happens and interrupt the request and allow you to debug it. But maybe you don't want to take that risk. So you might say, no, I only want you to ever fire once. And that's associating with this particular breakpoint, only ever fire once or some number of times. And I said you could decide what to do. The default is to intercept the thread and stop and look at it, but you can instead say, no, I just want to get an email. Okay, so all these things are configurable. And then if you do pause it, how long should it pause? So this again is a help to say I don't want to hang up the request forever, so it waits at most 60 seconds for you to respond to it, and if you don't respond, it keeps going. And then you can say, should it happen to any request that comes in for that request, or should I only intercept one request at a time and intercept and debug it and let others run and not bother them? So those are choices you can make. And I went perhaps a little ahead of, I shouldn't have gone into these details right now because it's a bit much for you to take in. So let's go ahead and set up an example. And I already have one set up. Here you go, you can see it here. And I can edit them. That's what this little icon is. I can edit it. So I had it set for a particular line in my templates and to stop on a particular line of code and to fire only once. And I'll show you later doing an email, but for now I'm going to do pausing the thread. So this is what typically you would do, and you could change these other things, but for now I'm just going to leave it at that, confirm these changes, and so now I'm going to run the page that's going to cause this problem. And here is the page I'm going to call. It's this test cfm.cfm, and I just want you guys to see I could have done Java, I could do CF script, but I'm going to do this cfml page that I've got. Now notice I've clicked the link, and normally I would see the page producing a result. But instead, because I turned the debugger on and set a breakpoint, and that breakpoint's enabled, and I hit that breakpoint, this request is not finishing. If you look down here at the bottom, it said waiting for carehart.org, and depending on your browser, you might see an icon like this saying, hey, the page is waiting. Now to the user, it looks like the request is hung, but what's happened is if I come into FusionReactor, up here at the top, that little icon appeared because I have a breakpoint waiting to be looked at. So if I click on that link, it takes me to this page that shows what requests have breakpoints waiting. And I could have more than one, but I only have one. Now at this point, if I don't do anything in 13, 12 seconds, it's going to just finish doing whatever it's supposed to do. So remember, I had 60 seconds to respond to it. But I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to show you how you can step into the code. So I've clicked on a little bug icon, and in a moment, and usually it's very fast, you'll see a display of the code that underlies that request. Now, I've honestly, never seen this not just come up immediately, and perhaps because I took so long, we got near the end of the request, it's probably gone. Yeah, you see it's gone. So I must have just missed my chance. But now this gives me a chance to show you what happens with this test page I set up is it's getting a divide by zero error, and we want to fix that error. So if it runs, and by the way, remember how I don't know if I showed you, but I'd said it's only run once, only break once, and we just, well, we didn't actually break, so maybe it didn't count as the one. So I'm going to go ahead and back up and run it again. Okay, so it wasn't about whether it ran once, but it was intercepted once. So that count is whether it's intercepted or you actually step through it. So because I'd set it to only count once. Now every time I run it, it just works. So if we go back to the FusionReactor display of the breakpoints, we're going to see that it did fire one time. We set it to only fire one time. It did fire one time, and that's why it's now disabled. And I can just re-enable it with this little checkbox here. So now it's re-enabled, simple as that. And now I'll go back and run it again. So I'll click that link. It spins. The request is being intercepted again now. And there's the bug icon, and I'll click on it, and I see it, and I'm going to click that little icon. And boom, here's the cool thing for those who have never done debugging before, step debugging. This does look like an editor, right? But it's not an editor. This is all web pages. This is all HTML. If I right-click, there's my browser stuff. This is all web browser stuff. And I'm sitting at whatever my line 1 is, and yeah, it's a simplistic example, not demonstrating best practice. Don't focus on the code, but look at a couple things that are interesting. So I can step through the code. These icons up here, just like traditional debuggers, for those that know it, I can step over line 1, which will take me in this case to line what? 4, right? So I click the step over button, and boom, I'm on line 4. Now at this point, I could step into it. For those that know CFML, that's another file being included into this file. I could step into it and see what's going on in there, but I want you guys to see you don't have to do that. There's a step over button. The purpose of the step over button is to say don't go into it, just execute it. And normally you should just use step over all the time. But step in is if you want to see what's going on in there. And we'll do that in a moment because I'm going to step over the include, and that set up some variables, and it doesn't matter right now what the variables are. And it's going to move on to the next line of code. And by the way, I noticed that that took a moment. I think there's some issues of either bandwidth or maybe something else running on my server, because most of you would never see such a delay. You just click the step over button and boom, the line moves to the next line. This usually is not a thing that's slow. Anyway, here we are now, and again, this is CFML, and it's not great CFML, but the point is I'm about to call a method in a CFC. And that CFC instance was created in here, so don't worry about that. But I've got a CFC instance that has a method, and I could just step over it and execute it, but I want you guys to see how powerful this is. I don't know where this CFC is, but CFML does. The underlying engine does. And a CFC is a component for you Java people. Same thing with if you invoked a Java component. If you created an instance of it and then called a method on it, the point is you could ask the debugger to go into that component or into that Java class and look at that method. We're going to go right to that method called foo. So I'm going to say step in, and it's going to find it. I didn't tell it where to find it. Nothing I did told it where to find it. It talked to the underlying engine, and the engine said where to find it. So here happens to be a CFC called some CFC, and it has a method called foo, and it's about to execute it. Notice I didn't go to 1, I didn't go to 3, I went right to 7, right to the method. So if this is a big component with lots of methods, I'd have been taken right to the method in question. I'm right at the beginning of it. I could step through it if I wanted to, and if it had hundreds of lines, I could debug it. But I want you to see that we don't need to do that. Let's say we looked at a couple things in here and go, okay, we're done. We can step out. That's what this button up here is about. Step out. That means leave the method or the include or whatever I'm in and continue running it, but then go back to where we started. And it goes back, and now I can continue stepping. And I'm going to get to the next line, which shows the CF set x equals to 0. And I'm going to do one more and stop and show you that that x, those who know CFML, that's a variable that was set in the variable scope, and there's variables, and there's x set to 0, and there's the sum var holding an instance of, or the result of the instance of calling this method. It resulted in some result. I can see my application variables, I can see cookie variables, session variables. If I do things like client variables and CF file and CF form, all that stuff is covered. So you could look at any variables you want. Now look at what's about to happen. It's about to do y equals 2 divided by x. X is equal to 0. If I let this run, if I stepped over this line of code, we'd get our error, divide by 0. But check this out. You can not only look at what's going on here, but you can change what's going on. So I'm going to change the value of 0. And I can change it here, or I can click up here and say I want to make x equal to 1 and set it. And now if we look at variables, we see x is equal to 1, And more importantly, if I now step over this line of code, I proceeded past it, I didn't get the error, and I'm about to output the result. And by the way, you don't have to keep stepping through the code. This button here says just finish, just resume, and if I mouse over it, it shows resume. And it ran to completion. And now if I come back here, there it is, done, y equals 2. Okay, so we've seen how the debugger works. We've seen how we can look at variables. We can set variables, really powerful. I could set conditions. In the interest of time, I'm going to just get back to, we've already talked about that. We've done that. You can set conditional breakpoints. You can also set it to stop on errors. And I said you could set it to send emails. Well, so if I had told it to send an email instead of intercepting the request, then it would not have intercepted. It would have just sent me an email. And let me just quickly grab an example email to show you guys. Give me just a moment. Can I modify the failing code with the debugger? Well, when you say modify the failing code, if you mean change the source code, no, remember this is not an editor. You can't touch the code, but you can modify the variables. Yes, so you can modify the variables, but not the code. Okay. Here's an example email that came when I had set that breakpoint to send an email. So there's the same page, there's the same breakpoint, and look, you get a stack trace showing at that moment what was a stack trace like. Again, not everybody knows or cares about those. That's not what's exciting. As I scroll down, now I see the variables, and I see the different variable scopes, application scope, CGI scope, client scope, cookie scope, HTTP scope. And while it's not clear in this example, let me just tell you, for instance, you can see that this variable's value was an instance of a CFC, so it just tells you that it's an instance of a CFC. If it had been a query, it would tell you that it was a query and how many rows were in that query, and I believe it shows about 10 rows from the query. And if it was an array or a struct, again, it would show you how big it was, but only show you some lines of it. If it was an array, only some number of elements. So that's all pre-configured, and it's limiting. So no, this email will never be huge despite how big your variables may be. Okay, so there's intelligence to everything that the FusionReactor team does. And if there's ever anything that you don't agree with that they've done, just contact support, and they are very responsive to listen and respond to feedback. All right. And I'll just say, I don't have time, but I'll be pointing in a moment to some videos, and in that video, I talked about how to limit whose IP address do we interrupt. So you could put a condition in that says if the IP address of the user making the request is a particular IP address, that's the condition. And then therefore, if you think about it, only requests from that IP would be intercepted. So it isn't a feature of the tool to limit whose IPs get intercepted, but you could programmatically set a condition. So that's powerful. And this debugger, like the profiler, works exactly the same and absolutely the same whether you're using Java or CFML and whether you're using tags or script. So it's a great tool. All right, so let's round out the discussion. We have a few minutes left before we're gone. Resources for these things. So resources on the profiler. There's a couple different resources about the profiler. Now, I know that you all can't write this down right now. Remember, you're going to get a link to this recording, so you can come back and watch this and see these links. You can also just Google FusionReactor Profiler, and these will be among the first results you get. But one is like a feature profile page, and the other is the docs about the profiler. And then same with the debugger. There's a feature page about the debugger, and then there's the docs about the debugger. And don't dismiss the docs. People often pay no attention to manuals. Pay attention to the manuals. You'll learn incredible stuff. And these go even further. I only showed you a couple of common examples of things, but this goes even further and shows other useful debugging examples to really stretch your mind to think about how you could use the tool. It also has a thing called using the debugger to investigate issues. It goes a little further into helping you understand how to use it. And then there's videos. I've mentioned that I've done videos. I did a longer one on the debugger with more details, going over more things, and then I've started to break it down into little small ones. So anyway, check those out. So those are the two major sets of features. And remember, we also talked about, let me just say this. If you are on FusionReactor and you manually installed it, not using the installer, but you manually installed FusionReactor, then you won't be able to use the debugger. Now, when I think it was Mark earlier said he couldn't see the profiler, I didn't understand how that could happen. But if you find you're on Ultimate and you can't get the debugger to enable, if you manually installed FusionReactor, then you need to take an extra step. And here's the manual telling you how to do that extra step. It just has to do with adding what's called a Java agent or agent path to your Java configuration. So again, I don't want to get into that now. Just take my word for it. And if you can't remember this URL, just write down that number and go to Google and say FusionReactor and that number, and it'll probably come up. But also, I'll show you the support address, and you can email them, and they'll let you know. And this is also discussed in a section called Production Debugger Installation. Now, I wanted to say, remember those earlier resources about enterprise features? If you're skipping from standard to ultimate, don't forget that you're not just getting those two ultimate features, you're getting these. So here's resources for the dashboard, resources for the mobile apps, resources for the reports, resources for that system resource view, and the application view. And some of these have been talked about in other webinars. So you can definitely learn more about these things later. And as far as more on addition differences, there's a couple pages that talk about the differences between standard, enterprise, and ultimate. If you need to point somebody to that for convincing them whether to buy it or not, those will show the three editions and what they include in different ways for different purposes. All right, so we've seen in conclusion that Ultimate adds these powerful production safe profiler and debugger features, and they can be so useful with the profiler to understand where time was spent within a request, and with the debugger to either step through code, modify values, and or send email with that tremendous information about some troubled code. And then you get these other additional features, and that's all on top of standard. So Ultimate is really Ultimate. It's got everything. As far as pricing, the differences between them is Ultimate is this price per month or per year if you lease it. Enterprise is this price per month or per year, and Standard is this price. You see it's just a $20 difference to add each one. And there are perpetual licenses, so you don't have to pay monthly if you don't want to. You can buy one time. It's usually worth about 3 years worth of rental before it makes sense to buy it instead. So you make that decision. All this is on the website. And don't forget, you get the free 14-day trial. It is Ultimate, so you can go try this out yourself right now. And I talked about how you can enable that Ultimate trial even if you're already running 6 Standard or Enterprise. So again, how would you do that? Contact sales or support if you need a reminder. Other upcoming webinars, we're going to do one in a couple weeks on troubleshooting, identifying issues. We're going to go into some of what I went through quickly there, slower and in some more detail, and connect some other dots to help you understand how to really solve problems using FusionReactor, using all the features, whether you're on Standard or Enterprise. And there's still others being planned. I mentioned, for instance, we're going to do one on the Enterprise dashboard probably, and still more. And to learn more about them and register, go to the webinar page. And I've said a couple times, here's the resources you want to know about. Just go to the website for downloads, docs, videos, tech notes, forums, and much more. Email either sales at or support at for any questions you have that maybe we've not covered or you trip over in the future. They're wonderful. They'll get back to you quickly. They're in Germany, so if you're like on the west coast of the U.S. and you email them in the midday, it's already nighttime to them, so they may not get back till the next day. And there's a phone number there, and that's a U.S. phone number. There's other ones as well. If you go to the website in the top right corner, it has this information as well. And we definitely welcome your feedback on these webinars, others you've been to or others you'd like to see. So please do give us your feedback. We'd love to hear. We don't generally hear much, and I'd love to know, especially for the ones I do, I want to know what you think. All right, so now let me turn to if there were any more questions that came up, and I've tried to address most of them as we go, so maybe there's none left, but just real quickly, let's see. Can I modify the variables in a way that every request has these new values, like a hotfix until the code is fixed? Well, that's an interesting point. So no, as it is by default, the way it's working right there, it's only in that request. So when you make that change, it's just that variable, just for that point in the code forward. And once you run it again, it's all starts over. Now, maybe you're aware of something that you've heard about. There is a feature that's not enableable in the interface, but is enableable through a configuration change, where there's been an experimental feature to enable you to script a response at a point in a breakpoint. So instead of intercepting it, you can script that at that point, change the value of some variable. And then once that script is made, you can say trigger that script when that line is hit and that condition is hit. And that you could think of as, yeah, kind of a temporary hotfix to your application. Now, a lot of people kind of grumbled at that, at the thought that that gives too much power and could be dangerous. So it's not enabled by default. If you're interested in more about that, contact sales or support, and they can tell you more about that. And as it kind of evolves, it'll be included in the webinars in the future, I suspect. Are there any other upcoming conferences? By conferences, I don't know if you meant webinars. I just showed you those. Maybe you asked that before. If you truly mean conferences, I'll say that I just did a blog post Friday. If you go to carehart.org, carehart.org. In fact, let me just call it up real quick. Carehart.org. I just did a blog post. If you go to Carehart. Carehart.org. At my blog, carehart.org blog, the very most recent post is lots of upcoming CFML related events. And I don't know if you meant, who asked that question, if you meant CFML events, but yes, there's the Adobe Government Summit coming up in April, Into the Box coming up in April, and CF Objective coming up in July. And the call for speakers is still open for CF Objective. And then there's also an Adobe Roadshow going on this week at various cities. And then there's the traditional other conferences later in the year, NC-DevCon, Adobe Summit, and CF Camp. And you can follow all these at a CF 411 page I have, where I have a category on conferences. So definitely come back and look at my blog for more on that. I think that was the last question. Yep, doesn't seem to be any more questions. Nobody else seems to be writing any. So with that, we're right just after the top of the hour. Apologize for going a minute over, a couple minutes over since we started. But thank you for everybody coming along. I enjoyed presenting it. Watch for the recording to show up in your email soon. And if you have questions or need more information, let us know and give us feedback. And until the next time.